with that, I will let you get started, Nir.
Awesome. Thanks, Mackenzie. So yes, Mackenzie has mentioned, I think, yeah, definitely if you want to submit any questions or anything like that, we're happy to answer them as we go through, but we'll probably leave about 10, 15 minutes at the end to kind of go through all of the questions, just because how the presentation structure, we're going to have a bit of a free-flowing conversation between Jer and I, and as much as whenever Jer and I do start talking, we can get kind of carried away. Definitely the questions will help us steer us back into something that's a bit more structured. But just to give you an overview, the topic really kind of came about a little while back. Jeremy and I were talking about just, the challenges with working from home, the conversations that we have around that, and specifically around how to kind of collaborate with our teams internally, specifically with competitive intelligence. And when I introduced Jer as well, people get an idea of some of his background and why I think it'll be really important to kind of get his perspective on it from both a sales and product marketing standpoint. But really for this, I'm going to spend about 5-10 minutes at the beginning just speaking about organizational alignment for competitive intelligence and thinking about the ways in which different departments use it and the challenges that we're seeing today, specifically around, the transition to working from home, thinking about ways in which we can use some of our digital tools to help continue that collaboration that we might have lost from like the being in person and in office conversations that we used to have. From there, we'll spend most of this webinar more so as a conversation between Jeremy and I. So Jeremy, I've worked with previously at Hootsuite. He comes from both a sales and product marketing background. So I think to get his perspective really around some of the challenges he's seen both sort of as boots on the ground, as well as building content and competitive intelligence that sales teams can use. And then from there, again, as I mentioned, just 5 to 10 minutes, the questions and wrap up as well, some key takeaways. But yeah, excited to kind of get started. So to begin, just wanted to kind of throw out a few poll questions that I think will help us kind of understand the audience and some of the background that people have. So really to start, I think kind of getting an idea of, what areas of the business are asking for competitive intelligence today. I know just based on our background, we're thinking about this from like the traditional way we think of competitive intelligence, which is that, sales is definitely the ones that are using it, and marketing and product marketing specifically are building that content. But as we get into this discussion, you'll start to understand that like a lot of different areas are starting to look at competitive intelligence. So it'd be interesting to hear, some of the feedback from a number of different organizations and the ways in which maybe some other areas of business are also looking for CI as well. I know my experience, so I've been in both sales and customer success, but within both roles, I think when I think of competitive intelligence, I definitely think about it both product related as well, how marketing thinks about competitive intelligence as well. And I think those are all areas we're starting to see more and more customers, even within Klue, the ways in which that other departments are thinking about, okay, from a product perspective, how do we think about where that product is going, what our product roadmap looks like versus our competitors? And then even with marketing, how does our messaging change, as well as, how do we keep our brand standing out in a very crowded marketplace? So it'll be interesting to kind of get your feedback as well on some of those areas. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to submit their answers. And then another one that I think, yeah, and as you can see, Jer, it's sales primarily. No surprise there in marketing. And then again, I mean, it's interesting that, product we've seen more and more often as well. And it makes sense to have that as an area. And we'll touch upon that as well as we go through some of those different areas. And then customer success, we've seen a lot for as well. The second sort of question that we want to ask the audience and get an idea of is, currently, how are you delivering some of those competitive insights to these teams? I think, at Klue, for example, when we start to work with a lot of our customers, there's just a variety of different ways in which they might be currently delivering that and where those challenges come from. So those could be slide decks, messaging channels, a shared drive. Definitely we see a lot, around ad hoc requests as well. And then if you're using any sort of CI platform as well, it'd be interesting to know. I think Jer has definitely been asked in many different formats here, and he's been providing sort of CI content across these different areas. And so that's where, you know, when we talk about the ways in which we want to centralize that and why that's important today, you'll start to see that, like, I'm sure the answers here will be very disparate in terms of where people are actually delivering that content. Yeah, messaging channels. And that actually is a good segue into thinking about, you know, those water cooler chats. And when we think about messaging channels, I'm sure people put that as the answer today because they don't have sort of those office conversations. And I think before, when we think about sort of those water cooler conversations, you know, we have a number of different people that might be in the office just speaking to, you know, certain win stories that have happened, or a competitor has jumped into a deal, or a competitor has joined the landscape. And we'll talk about that within the office. And that's information that's kind of just in the air, and someone might gather some intel and take that into another conversation, but it might not be recorded or logged into anything, and it kind of gets lost. I think with today's environment, as we all work from home and we're pretty remote, I think we can all relate to Michael Scott. I can definitely relate to him, kind of feeling like I'm on an island, and definitely that siloed sort of mentality starts to kind of be very pervasive across a lot of organizations, as product marketing has started to lose some of the ways in which they can engage some of these go-to-market teams and be able to ask them a lot of like key questions about, you know, one, are you getting the right content? What are you hearing in the marketplace today? You know, what are other areas that we can help in? And I think this is across the, you know, a lot of different departments, and we're definitely trying to find ways in terms of being able to keep everyone connected. And I think having lost that, it's really driven the need to kind of help provide a centralized area where people can both submit content and feedback, as well as be able to digest that content as well for their specific roles. And that's really where we think about, you know, where product marketing kind of sits when they're building out that competitive enablement program. It doesn't mean that they're working on it, you know, in this siloed environment. They're really connected to sales, customer success, marketing, product. As we saw in that first poll, you know, I think a lot of these different areas are asking for it, whereas we've always traditionally thought of product marketing building this just for sales. But I think competitive intelligence, we're seeing more and more often, is critical across the organization. And so the need to kind of centralize that and provide it in a way that applies to each area, it's super important. And, you know, we can start with product marketing and how they're tasked with building that competitive intelligence. So really, when you think about product marketing, their goals are creating that sort of enterprise-wide competitive enablement program and strategy, but then also ultimately enabling those go-to-market teams to win more against the competition. So the questions that I'm sure they're having that they miss, you know, having around the water cooler are, you know, what does our competitive coverage look like today? Getting that feedback, you know, thinking about some of the non-primary competitors that you think of, the ones that are starting to creep into some deals or within the conversations that you're having with customers, as well as, you know, how efficient is that collection curation process today? And that would ultimately lead to what the effectiveness of those battle cards, or the ways in which you present that information as well to those go-to-market teams, and getting an understanding of like usage as well, right? I think when we were all sitting around in the office together, I think there were a lot of opportunities to kind of get that feedback in terms of, hey, what's working, what isn't working? But now with that lost, I think we've got to figure out other ways and strategies, which Jer and I will definitely talk about throughout. So to talk about that sort of traditional use case around sales, obviously, you know, when we think about competitive intelligence, the teams that are definitely using it the most today are the sales teams. And really it's around, you know, being able to increase that competitive win rate, increase revenue, as well as just, you know, getting an understanding of how to help, you know, new sales reps, for example, not only using it as sort of a competitive intelligence idea, but like also as a sales enablement tool. So understanding what the market looks like, what the landscape looks like. And so the feedback that we often hear in that same sort of mindset of what do we miss from that water cooler chat is, you know, how do you trust the intel that you're getting? Is it easy to find and access? what's missing. So some of those areas that I think product marketing teams miss some of that feedback, it's important to get that still. And we'll go into some of the ways that we want to make sure we're engaging these go-to-market teams so that we continue to get that engagement from them. Marketing, as I had mentioned, it's really around when you think about how crowded the marketplace is today, how do we reinforce and protect that brand, discover new areas of opportunity to stay ahead of competitors, based on some of their changes that they might have to strategy and approach to market, as well as like learning about new competitors or partnerships that are entering into the market. I think that kind of competitive intel helps drive and shape what your marketing strategy will be as well. So having all of that sort of in a place, you can see how marketing could also use competitive intelligence as well. Near and dear to my heart, obviously, is customer success, and how, even for myself or our teams use competitive intelligence. I think that is definitely gaining a lot of momentum in the idea that, we're used to thinking of the post-sales environment, not having to deal with the competitors or having to like keep in touch with like what the landscape looks like, because we're like, hey, we've locked in this customer. But what we found is, and we'll talk about this, is are we aware of what our competitors look like, what, other people within the space are doing? Because there's going to be challenges where it might not be our stakeholders that we work on a day-to-day basis. It could be people within an organization that have started to see something maybe at a conference or a webinar or another presentation, and they're like, hey, I saw this, are we able to do this? Like those are those, key points that you want to be ahead of. And I think with customer success, it's definitely becoming something that we definitely incorporate a lot of competitive intelligence as we get into those discussions with our customers with, hey, how do you find that you're getting value out of the program and tools that we've provided? And then finally, product. I think, this is one that not, across all of our customers, we're not seeing product teams get into competitive intel, but definitely a few recently. And, this could be just with the remote environment. I've definitely seen where product teams are trying to validate their product roadmap and vision against competitors. They want to learn more about, what are those customer challenges that we might not be hearing about, but based on trends we're seeing in the market landscape, that could give us a really good intel into like, hey, these are some customer challenges that maybe we can kind of start to incorporate within our own product or integrations that we want to think about. And then also thinking about like the ways in which we want to introduce sort of new tools or build off of what we have. We can kind of base that off of the market landscape as well. So really, this conversation that I'm about to have is just centered around this idea that, product marketing kind of sits and is tasked with competitive intelligence, but it's really interconnected with every area within an organization, whether that's product, sales, customer success, or marketing. So we want to make sure that we're, thinking about those roles as well and what their needs and goals are as we build out a competitive intelligence program. Whereas traditionally it was very much, we're going to build something that's just for like a go-to-market team and how to enable them, and not really think about these other areas themselves. And ultimately what you'll see is that with a lot of our customers and even with Jer and his experience, when you build out a competitive intelligence program that kind of takes into account all of these areas, we get a lot of like great traction across an organization as well. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce Jeremy Goldstein. We work together at Hootsuite, but he reminds me of someone that sort of sat in the nexus of all of these different departments and areas. And I think his experience will be really useful in kind of understanding what those challenges are between different departments and how they utilize competitive intelligence. So we work together at Hootsuite very closely on a number of deals. And then he moved over to Tapalytics, where he was the product marketing manager. So worked closely with not only sales enablement, but like the marketing team themselves, and now has moved back into sales as a solutions engineer at Slack. So again, that sort of partnership with sales and product, but again, thinking about the ways in which competitive intelligence is utilized in that way. So Jeremy, welcome. Great to have you. I know we've had many discussions for some time, so I'm happy to kind of get you on here and start to operationalize a lot of our discussions and thinking about the ways in which we can actually incorporate, you know, competitive intelligence, both in sales, but in other areas of the business as well, which I think you've talked about a lot when I've reached out to you about just feedback on how to roll out and build a CI program.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm on? Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks so much, Niresan. I'm super happy to be a special guest in this webinar. And as you know, competitive intelligence is something that I feel really strongly about. So I'm looking forward to our chat and, you know, kind of straight shooting it based on both of our experiences working with competitive intelligence. So looking forward to getting into it with you.
Awesome. So I guess to start, and I think this is where, you know, I reached out to you a couple months ago and just wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, when you moved from sales at Hootsuite into a product marketing role, and obviously you were tasked with kind of building out a CI program within Tapalytics. Like, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, like, you know, when we're building up that sort of foundation, what are some of those like key items or stakeholders that you want to get involved with as you think about, okay, if I'm just starting from scratch with a CI program, what are those important elements that you want to think about?
Yeah, so a few things to touch on there. And before I talk about those tactical items or teams to work with, I think what you introduced at the start here is really important, which is aligning on actually why competitive intelligence is so important. So I've worked for 4 different companies with different competitive intelligence fields. And sometimes I hear a thought of, hey, we want to be competitor aware, but customer obsessed. And there feels like there's this spectrum of caring about competitors versus caring about customers. And I think that while there's a lot of merit to that sentiment, I think it actually has the relationship between the two incorrectly portrayed, in that I do think that competitive intelligence is part of customer obsession, because the reality of it is most of us are selling in markets that are incredibly competitive. And if we want to be serving our customers effectively, and if in sales we want to be trusted advisors, helping our customers figure out the competitive landscape and what's the right feel is just a really foundational part of the job. So I think A is just making sure that the whole organization is aligned with the reality of why competitive intelligence is important. The second piece that I think is an important item to talk about before we talk about like teams to work with is what makes good competitive intelligence versus what makes not so great in competitive intelligence. So obviously all of this can vary organization to organization, but it's always helpful to do an audit of, hey, what do we have today? What's working, what's resonating versus what are all the gaps that we're feeling? And so for instance, I've been in situations where competitive intelligence can feel really surface level and very focused on positioning as opposed to focused on some of the juicier how parts of competitive differentiation. So actual things that are different in the product that can enforce your positioning statements and how you describe a competitor. So I think it's really important to get a sense of whoever you're working with, what they think is important and what they think is valuable. But then lastly, when I think about like another foundation that makes a really successful competitive intelligence program is aligning, and I feel like I'm saying aligning a lot, so I'm going to try to stop with that buzzword, but aligning with the go-to-market strategy or rigor that your sales or marketing team has. And what I mean by that is, are you going up market in enterprise? Do you have more of a commercial inbound model? Is it product-led growth? Do you have seasoned salespeople? Do you have more junior salespeople? And making sure that whatever you're looking to do is kind of built for those specific types of sellers or programs in mind. And if you have all of them, that's great. It's just really important to know that you're tailoring for those different groups. Even things like within those, right, is your head of sales like really into challenger selling or solution selling or gap selling? Because all of those small little differences, while as a seller, they're all tools in your tool belt, as a product marketer, as a competitive intelligence person, if you're not aware of how they're selling, then sometimes your competitive intelligence can fall flat. So those are some of the things that I usually recommend thinking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that sort of like the idea of customer obsession and competitive intel kind of living on their own separate islands. And I think often what I see is that that comes from like a top down sort of mentality, right? Like I think at like an executive level, when they view competitive intelligence, they're thinking of this as like one piece. They're thinking of the customer obsession sort of like internally, what is it? Like, how are we customer obsessed? But in reality, to your point, I think if you don't really understand how we differentiate, how we're kind of like, how the market is kind of trending, things like that, you can't really kind of like double down on the customer obsession piece. And I have seen at a lot of organizations where they've kind of keeping that siloed. And it's interesting, someone from customer success, like our focus, for example, is the customer obsession piece. And so we've kind of overlooked the competitive intelligence side of things, and often to the detriment, you know, of a lot of conversations that we're having where it helps provide context for our stakeholders as well that we're working with in terms of the value of our program versus what they're seeing in the market as well, so that they get validation of like, hey, you know, I went with the right vendor here. This is what works for me because, you know, here's what the trends look like in that market space.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting. What kind of competitive conversations do you find yourself in as a CSM?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think for me, it's interesting as sort of like the post-sales environment and like the account management side of things. I think when I think of competitive intel, it's not so much that I am competing with the way in which maybe a sales rep might be competing with another, like a prospect, and they're competing against a specific competitor. I'm actually trying to train my key stakeholders as extensions of myself or extensions of our company. So I'm trying to arm them with the right information that, you know, where I find most of the times I get into competitive situations is that, you know, a key stakeholder hears from like another area or another exec has come across a competitor and is like, hey, they were mentioning so-and-so. It looks like they're exploring that. How do I deposition that internally? And so for me, it's like arming my stakeholders with the right information about what the marketplace is doing. And so for me, I rely on our product marketing team or whomever it might be to give me that information in a way that I can easily transfer that to our key stakeholders so that they can deposition internally. And so I think that's where, you know, when I think about that customer obsession and what you mentioned about like trusted advisor, if I can do that with my customers and get them that information super quickly, I found that, you know, they're able to kind of be like, hey, I was quickly able to kind of deposition this internally and I didn't have to do much work on my end. So I think that's where definitely, you know, on my end, I see a lot of that competitive intel kind of coming into play.
Yeah. And that's so interesting because, so again, sometimes in competitive intelligence or product marketing, or even in solutions engineering, when you're working with your team, you're thinking so internal focused, right? So, hey, we do challenger selling. Let's make sure that our competitive intelligence and our recommendations are aligned to that. But the reality is, like you're mentioning, is our customers that we're dealing with might have a completely different internal selling motion that what you're recommending isn't going to align with. So it's kind of that tricky battle in terms of you need to be prepared for so many different situations, which is why I think it's really important not to make things black and white in terms of when you're rolling out recommendations of, hey, go with this approach and not that approach, but also balancing that with just having a lot of information that people like yourself in customer success and post-sale to maneuver and give their clients to then even work with internally. So, you know, I think, for example, like we always like to think about not using checklists when comparing to competitors, but what happens when that's just like this standardized way that your customers are evaluating different technologies, right? So being prepared for those nuances that are going to be realistically existing within our customers, I think is such an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we talked about this, right? In the ways in which we want to structure content that we're providing.
Yeah.
You know, there's often this approach that you don't want to arm go-to-market teams with like just feature discussions and pricing discussions, like getting into the weeds and those things. And I think, Jared, we've been on in a number of situations together where it has come down to, hey, this is going to have to be like a feature battle and I need that content. And I think sometimes like like when you think about product marketers that you've talked to, or even within when you were building out the CI program, it seems like there's like a reluctance sometimes to get that information to them because they're trying to guide, you know, certain go-to-market teams to not get into those conversations, but you still do need to provide that content, because I think the reality of these conversations that you have with prospects or customers is that they become very free-flowing. And it's not necessarily like there's going to be a checklist of items of like, even as much as we want to be able to say like, here are those 2 or 3 points to help deposition, you're still going to often get into those, you know, deeper in the weeds conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's important to bring up, because I think that's one of the areas where I see the most amount of, I don't want to say conflict, but disconnect between sales and product marketing, which is, I've noticed a lot of marketing teams and marketing philosophies really encourage shying away from any type of feature comparison. Like feature comparison has this taboo of like really junior amateur selling. And if that's the only way that you're comparing to a competitor, I completely agree. It's not, it shouldn't be the go-to, and it shouldn't be the only approach. But the reality is, as sellers, we know is that the how and the features of what customers are going to use to unlock their use cases and to solve their problems, what you actually provide in your technology is such an important part of that. So if you're trying to avoid that conversation all the time, and you're trying to just always keep it around big picture positioning, they're good at focusing on this, we're good at focusing on this, but don't get into the how, it's a really easy way to just kind of like make your customer feel like they're talking to someone that maybe doesn't know the specifics of how you're different, or sounds kind of like sales robotic-y. So yeah, I do think it's important to just be aware of the realities that exist, and that sometimes those rules of like never doing something aren't going to be relevant, and instead thinking about giving your sales team all these different tools that they can use in different situations.
Yeah. So Jerry, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, because you did mention the idea of like good intel versus intel that might not be as useful, for example. Can you expand on that a little bit in terms of, you know, when you're like, how do you have those discussions internally around what is considered good intel? Because this is going to vary from company to company. It's going to vary, as you mentioned, based on like sales leadership philosophy, things like that. But, you know, what are some of those sort of good leading questions or talking points that can help drive that discussion around what good intel is versus what's not?
Yeah, that's a super good question. So I think the best place to start is with your experienced reps. So whether those are AEs, obviously I'm biased, but I think SEs are a gold mine for competitive intel, CSMs, and asking them, hey, what are the things that you've talked about with clients that have worked in convincing them that you're the best fit? And generally, I think when you're asking reps that have actually been in the field, that's when you'll get things that are really specific, as opposed to broad generalities that you might see in marketing material or in a battle card, which I don't think is like a bad thing. I just think you need both. So, you know, for example, if I don't want to call out a specific technology, I don't want to talk about one that I've sold per se, but like, let's say you were selling, you know, Spotify versus Apple Music. And on a marketing team, you went, hey, integrations for Spotify are a huge advantage versus Apple Music, right? But when you go to a rep and talk about like, hey, what have you talked about that's really worked, right? They'll tell you, hey, actually, like the Spotify integration with the Sonos was really important for a lot of customers. And it's like those levels of specifications that are really important to understand, because that will then help you understand like, okay, you got your headline, but you also have all your sub bullet points. And those levels of specificity also give reps an understanding of, hey, what are the really important things that I need to look for to make sure that this is going to be a good fit? Because I think the reality of competitive differentiation and conversations today is just like, as a rep and as a marketing team, you're just trying to figure out realistically what customers are the absolute best fit for your technology, and then educating buyers and prospects as to why that is in somewhat of a most realistic fashion as possible. So I think like starting with asking reps specifically what they've talked about to move the needle is probably a pretty good place to start. And then the other point there is like, what makes good competitive intel versus not so great competitive intel. I would say, while it's hard to get, it's those really specific points that make it real for customers.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's funny, you know, over here at Klue is like I've been working with a lot of customers that are just starting to come on board. I've almost made it a bit of a mandatory requirement to get sales folks in on some of the early discussions. Like, even if we haven't built out the content, it's to get their sort of feedback. Because I think just to, like, you know, when we think about who's looking for a program like a platform like Klue, it'll be someone from a marketing team or product marketing that wants to build out CI, and they don't engage like a sales stakeholder until very much they've built the content and they're like, hey, we want to get feedback on the content. But what I have found, and what's been super helpful, is getting some really, you know, experienced sales reps or sales leadership in on those early discussions around what are the areas that we should be focusing on. What are the areas that are impactful to us? And I think that is a good kind of like segue into the idea that you had around sales leadership alignment, right? I think what's so interesting, and, you know, the companies that we've worked for, I'm sure you've seen this, where that philosophy changes from company to company, from team to team, and the ways in which, and so if you're building out content based on even what like maybe like sales reps are telling you, for example, but ultimately that doesn't ladder up to like what sales leadership's philosophy is, for example, they're not going to get the adoption of that CI content because there might be told like, that's not the approach that we want to take with prospects, for example. And so then your CI content just becomes very irrelevant because they're just like, well, I can't use this because my boss doesn't want me taking that approach. And so getting that buy-in at that leadership level as well, I think is super important in terms of getting the adoption of your actual CI content.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think obviously this conversation's about bridging gaps between sales and marketing, but I think having a good understanding of how a sales leader wants his team to operate is the most important thing to bridging that gap. And so just to talk like tactics here, one of the ways that I've done that in the past is like, all sales leaders have a ton of experience selling. They have a ton of experience talking to competitors. And so the question is, hey, what are the ways that you like to talk about competitors, right? And then they'll usually go on a rant about, okay, like at my last company, like this is what we would say. And then you would go, okay, like if you wanted to take that same approach here, what are the key gaps of information that you have? And they'll be like, okay, well, we don't know XYZ about this competitor. We don't know about this space at all. And then that kind of gives you a little bit of your roadmap, at least like from the sales perspective of okay, like what are the blanks that we need to fill? And then filling those blanks and being like, okay, like based on kind of the framework that you like for competitive differentiation or competitive conversations, like here's the full argument put together. Because sales leaders don't have the time, obviously, to go and look at competitors. They might not have the nuanced product understanding or interest to do so. So kind of being that partner and going into those details for them and then inserting it into their sales philosophy, I think is a really important way to make sure that your message, or like just even frankly, like the hard work that you need to do to get good competitive intel is used properly.
Yeah, definitely. So what I wanted to, I mean, obviously having, you know, you've definitely helped with kind of building out like a CI program, but also using the content as well. I think we've talked about this at length in just our own private conversations around this, but what are some of the key things that you think about when now that you've built sort of that foundation and have some of that buy-in and understand how to structure the content, what are some of those key components around actually rolling out a program and getting engagement around competitive intelligence? Because I think what I've found is, you know, you could do everything that you want and get all that, but actually when you roll out the program, it kind of falls flat sometimes. And I know we touched upon this around sales leadership, but what are some of the other key components you want to think about?
Yeah, so a couple points to rant about there, and I hope it's okay that I'm ranting because I do want to have this be a fluid thing. But like, so the key word here is that it's a program, right? It's not CI content, it's not CI collateral, it's not CI enablement, it's a program. And the analogy that I think might be helpful here is it's like a university in a sense, right? Or a college or, you know, sophisticated education program, in that, you know, you have your you have your professors who are doing research and giving inspiring lectures, which may be something like what a product marketer does. Then you have your micro groups that are working together on projects of digesting that information and applying it, kind of like TAs, which maybe is sales enablement or maybe product marketing as well, depending on the organization. And then you might have also like projects and elements to make sure that that understanding and that knowledge is reinforced. So I do not recommend exams at all. I hated exams, but little fun activities that you can do to make sure that, you know, that information is working. So I don't think like those three things are like the default avenues, but I think it's one example of thinking about competitive intelligence as this holistic element that has a lot of different layers to make sure that things are working. But then on that last point of how do you make sure that it's engaging for reps, I think that is one of the most interesting conversations today right now, especially because of remote work, because these sessions, like sitting in on webinars and just listening to sales enablement folks or product marketing folks just give information, is maybe not going to be working so well anymore, in that reps are sitting on calls all day long, everyone's on Zoom, and it's hard to pay attention, let alone for hours on end about competitors. So I think there's also a really big opportunity, and I'd love to get your thoughts on what you're seeing with your clients of reimagining that education model to make things maybe more bite-sized, more interactive to help with that retention.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I remember you mentioned this because I came to you for some feedback on just some thoughts I had around how to roll out when you have a number of different competitors, for example, right?
Yeah.
I think one approach I've seen is you either roll out all at once, all of these competitors. So like say within like a Klue platform, you're like, hey, here's all of the competitive intel. You can go for all of your different competitors. Or the other approach is let's focus on one competitor and then just think about that and replicate that across all the different sort of other competitors. But what I thought was interesting that you had suggested a little while back was a drip campaign. So you treat a CI program sort of like a drip campaign where you kind of like, you know, sequentially start talking about every competitor over a certain period of time. And it's not sort of like all this information at once. And I think when you do that, what you can also do is kind of focus on some like key win stories around that competitor, or start to kind of build sort of a narrative around each competitor that I think kind of helps drive home why it's important to kind of think about the competitive intelligence for each of these as well individually, as well as holistically. And I think there's a lot of things that you learn because like, you know, I think back to our Hootsuite days, right? Like we had competitors that were very similar to us, but we also had competitors that were not similar in the sense that like, you know, I'll take Salesforce as an example, right? Like Salesforce social isn't a key component of what they're, you know, it's not a key component of their business, but they had a social component. And so the ways in which they challenged us was very different than say a social media competitor like Sprinkler, which is very much like us. And I think being able to kind of like provide some nuance and narrative around each competitor allows us to kind of think about that, like the competitive landscape isn't sort of a one size fits all. And you've got to think about these things in a very different way. And I remember coming to you many times about like, hey, I'm in a competitive deal against Salesforce right now. I need your help. And a lot of that was you helping to kind of shape like, hey, don't, you know, the ways in which you want to like think about that specific competitor is really important. And I would have just taken that competitive intel and used it as sort of a one size fits all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think like another reality that is kind of related to that is, so for example, I was in product marketing, I would deliver these competitive sessions. Hey, great feedback, Jeremy. That was really interesting, really compelling. 2 months later, I'd get a question about a competitor, which is mirroring the exact same content that I delivered. I'm like, wait a second, were you not listening? Did you not get it? And the reality is now that I've been in sales, is you're sitting in these sessions, but it only really, really drives home when you need to use it in a real life situation. So 2 things related to that is, I think another thing, if you're in competitive intelligence or if you're in product marketing, again, if we're thinking back to this university analogy, is that you're also going to find yourself being a little bit of a librarian of sorts, which is, you know, folks coming with these situations that you need to help them with and kind of being that, arbiter of all these different knowledge sources you have, but also having them digest it and navigate it for a specific context. So just accepting that that's going to happen all the time. And no matter how good your delivery is, there's going to be these situations where you need to reinforce things. But then the other point from that I think is helpful is like when you're thinking about a drip campaign, just think about, and you're thinking about assignments, right? Like oftentimes in sales, we have to do these big role play assignments. And if you're more serious, a senior rep, maybe you're rolling your eyes like, oh, great, another role play in front of the whole team, kind of like a show off contest. But I think what I've seen to be more effective is smaller little assignments or smaller little activities that replicate like completely real scenarios. So like, hey, maybe you did a session on a competitor. First assignment, like write an email comparing the two in a prospecting email. Assignment number 2, like what are a couple questions you would ask in a discovery? Assignment number 3, hey, you're giving a demo. What's a subtle way that you could kind of like, you know, make yourself seem different? So just having those like little things that are super real that like maybe a rep will more be interested in participating in and a little bit more digestible as opposed to this like big role play day.
Yeah, and I think that something that you'd always kind of drilled home to me was the idea that like, you know, and I began the presentation by saying product marketing is tasked with building out this like CI program. And so,
yeah,
you know, I think of like things that I'm tasked with, and I think of just my goals, for example, and what I want to achieve. But ultimately, like, it's not about making the content digestible for me. It's how do I make, you know, my go-to-market teams the stars of the show, right?
Yeah.
That's what's going to help when we're thinking about like driving engagement. It's like ways in which we want to make sure that like they look good. Like I know we're kind of like, you know, if the marketing team's sort of like the makeup artists and the set designers and, you know, all the behind the scenes folks that don't get a lot of love, but like ultimately there is validation when you know that like you've made those go-to-market teams sort of the stars of the show. And that's kind of the approach that you want to take. Because I've seen areas where like a product market team is just focused on like, I'm going to make this content look really good to like my boss. And not ultimately like what's going to look good for a go-to-market team to use and actually digest. So just want to get some of your thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, I think that's the probably biggest revelatory moment that I had in sales enablement when I was in product marketing. And even to this day, I try to think about that in sales engineering, which is, you're right, like much like when you're in sales, like it's not about you, it's about the customer. When you're in sales enablement, it's not about you as a product marketer, it's about the sales team. And one of the most impactful ways to reinforce that is giving the sales team the ability to show their skills and own parts of your competitive intelligence program with each other. So again, like back to my example earlier, when I was early in product marketing, I was like, I want to put on these awesome presentations and I want to build everything and look great. And again, 2 months later, I'd be getting all these questions. I'd be like, did anyone listen? But when I made it like, hey, we're going to do a competitive intelligence session. First part is going to be AE from the mid-market talking about this. Second part is going to be CSM talking about this situation. Part 3 is going to be whatever, an SDR talking about prospecting. And you just kind of become the host as a product marketer that's like working with them to put on the show. That was miles more impactful because A, those reps retain that info better. But B, oftentimes they actually delivered it way better than I ever could as a product marketer because they were in the weeds with customers in real situations. So putting it on them to actually own competitive intelligence and sales enablement delivery can also be a really impactful thing. Takes a little bit of work off of you as a product marketer. And it's also a way for a lot of sales teams to kind of develop leadership skills and to go outside of their usual role of just working with customers specifically.
Yeah, and I even think about, you know, the ways in which, even when I think about my career, for example, right? And, you know, things that I provided in terms of value as I like, you know, was looking to kind of move into certain areas within my team or move into another area. I think having an understanding of like competitive landscape, for example, can be a great lever to use as like a value add within your own organization, right? And I think of like, when you talked about segmenting even like your go-to-market teams as like veteran versus new sales reps, like it's an opportunity to kind of provide, some of those veteran sales reps that want to kind of build out their skill set. It's like, hey, here's an opportunity to kind of think about and the ways you can educate your internal organization around the competitive landscape, around competitors, how to position yourself. I think even for yourself, I remember you were sort of the go-to person for a number of key competitors that we had at Hootsuite. And I thought, I know you probably hated it because everyone would start to come at you and bug you about like a certain competitor, but it really did provide a lot of value within the organization as like, hey, Jeremy knows everything you need to know about this competitor and has helped win deals based off this competitor. And I think there is that component as well to kind of think about when you're driving around that engagement, like highlighting those successful stories that you hear of people using competitive intelligence in the field or within their roles and how they use it internally. I think when you're thinking of the ways, because again, competitive intelligence, people think like, hey, I'm in a deal, someone's talked about competitor X, like this is when I'm going to use competitive intelligence. But it's not so much the case anymore, where it also just is like, to your point about like that university program, it's like an education piece as well.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting. Like when I was in product marketing, part of me had a little bit of maybe ego or insecurities about, hey, what if salespeople know more about the competitors than I do, right? Like I need to be the expert. But I think that's totally backwards, because there's merit to thinking about not only your customer journey, but your rep journey, right? So maybe in the first 3 to 6 months, like you're their go-to person for getting a sense of the field and becoming more compelling with customers. But when a rep has been with a company 2 years, 3 years, maybe a part of their growth is to be experts in a certain competitor and them to own a domain. And it's on you in product marketing or sales enablement to foster that team kind of approach to competitive intelligence. So I think, yeah, it's like that type of stuff should not only be embraced, but encouraged and fostered from a product marketing side.
No, I agree. And I think like one of those things is, it's, we tend to focus too much on like trying to know it all. And that's what's the beauty of like something like competitive intelligence and getting that organizational alignment, is that there's going to be a lot that you'll learn from other teams as well internally.
Yeah.
You build out a program that does incorporate those different areas. I think there's a lot that I've learned around product, for example, by engaging the product teams around what do you know about the landscape? And there's a lot that product has learned as well from me, where they might not have realized like, hey, that's not necessarily how the customer is being challenged right now. And maybe we need to kind of rethink that. So definitely getting that organizational alignment is super important for that reason as well. Because you kind of get that buy-in across the board.
Yep, totally.
Yeah. So just in terms of like other ways, I think when we think of like the work from home and the remote environment and losing some of that collaboration, what are some other challenges that you've seen or tactics that you might want to incorporate that resonate more now with like this remote environment? I know for myself, like I think about the information collection, for example, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that's been a bit of a struggle in the environment that we're in today, where we've lost a lot of that. And I go back to the meme that I had at the beginning, but it's like just the conversations that we have in the office are lost. So there's that collection piece. What about as well, like just on the curating and consuming, like, can you touch upon some of those pieces as well and where those challenges lie today?
Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge, because you're right. We're not in the office. We're not talking to each other. We're not meeting or having those conversations. So I think not to plug our tools, but I think tools become incredibly important to marry the flexibility of everyone's lives with the information that they need. So whether that's having everything in Klue that people can go to when they need it, whether it's using an internal comms tool like or like Workplace or Slack or Google, whatever your tool is, to make sure that you have a team spirit to competitive knowledge sharing, to competitive questions, to competitive discussions that are happening in those places. So obviously it won't replace the in-office discussion, but I do think thinking formally of like, how do we want to talk about competitors internally through tools is something that's really important now. And then the other thing is too, like also having new ways to request help, having new ways to request deal support. Because before, right, maybe you're just going to turn to someone, talk to them in the office like, hey, can we figure this out real quick? But now maybe folks would feel less willing to ping someone on Slack. Maybe folks will feel less willing to put time on someone's calendar. So thinking about making competitive intelligence and competitive discussions really accessible to everyone with maybe more formalized processes. So for example, at Slack, like there's a competitive help workflow where if you need a competitive expert to help you on a deal, there's an automated workflow where you type in the request that you have, what you have going on, and then boom, right through Slack, you can get paired up with someone that's going to be able to help you out. So figuring out ways to just kind of overcome this lack of in-person connection we have to make sure that people are still talking about these things and working together.
Yeah, and I think about that even with like the challenges of remote onboarding, right? I think,
yeah,
you know, I've seen this across a number of people that I've talked to, and in the ways in which, to your point, it's like Zoom fatigue you hear about all the time. You hear about like, you know, schedules being all over the place, things like that. And I think having like central areas where you can kind of provide sort of education internally and provide a lot of those enablement tools is more than super important today, and kind of helps, to your point, it's some people just are kind of nervous about the ways in which to engage the teams that they might have just joined, and maybe feeling like, oh man, I don't know a lot about the market landscape, or I don't know a lot about this specific competitor. I don't want to come off, you know, looking dumb on a sales meeting call where I'm called upon. So it's like, hey, I've now found this place where, one, it's information that's like, you know, when I think about the ways in which I've learned, or if you, for example, when you use Klue, it's like curated by a team internally, right? Like they've built this out, they've curated it. So it's like talking points that for the most part, we all agree upon and can help drive that sort of rep productivity pretty quickly.
Yeah, and then just like an X factor there, I think, is I'm a huge fan of video as well, to be incorporated in remote enablement and a new way of sharing information. So for example, why not get a video of your best AE giving an example of a prospecting call and a competitive objection comes up? Or I don't know how everyone's use of video recording has increased, but now we're not meeting customers in person. So everything's happening over Zoom. Maybe there's opportunity to use technology like Chorus or Gong and recording all those conversations and making a playlist of like, hey, here are all the different times we talked about a competitor. Here are best examples. Here are examples where it didn't go so well. So I think video is also another rising tool to help with the remote education.
Perfect. Jer, I know like all of our phone conversations, this definitely goes way over.
Yeah,
so I
are
want to
people
be
still
cognizant
on?
of time. Yeah. So I want to get to some questions, but again, just some key takeaways I think we can quickly touch upon. Again, I think we started with that sort of idea about aligning with departmental leadership and philosophy when you're building out sort of the foundation of your program. We've talked about sort of making that go-to-market teams, your sales reps, sort of the stars of the show, as well as kind of mapping maturity and structure. So when you think about like where your sales teams are at today, and maybe even having more granular enablement sessions based on what that maturity and structure of those teams are, so you get more resonant engagement. And then, you know, touching upon as well the CI program as like a drip campaign, rather than doing it all at once. I think we've seen there's a lot of effective ways of kind of incorporating competitors over time and helping drive that engagement and reinforcing, I think we talked about this a lot, is just reinforcing the value of competitive intelligence for what they're looking to do. So a couple of questions have come up. Jared, so
Got questions, bring them on. We'll
I'll get to a couple of these. So I think one question that came up in the chat was, does CI vary by region to region? For example, North America versus like another region? I think, at least with my customers, definitely. And it depends on the company as well. But we've definitely seen a lot of customers that look at regional competitive intelligence. But I think when we're working in terms of that collaboration piece, there is a real big importance in understanding how these other regions are dealing with the competitors in their region as well. I think that it doesn't become like a siloed idea. It's very much like, okay, like how does that market approach, how is that affecting their market? But like also, are those trends that might come to our region, for example? And so being on top of that. So having the regional content is important, but I also feel like having accessibility to that regional content is also important for everyone, so that they're aware of some of what those challenges might come later on, right?
Yeah, totally. And also different regions. I know it's easy to talk about doing all this, but it's hard to actually do if you're in the actual world of product marketing or competitive intelligence. But different regions may have different levels of buying maturity. They may be in different stages of how they're using technology. And because of that, you might want to tailor the content and programs that you're delivering to different regions based on that.
Yeah. Another question, I think, Jared, this would be interesting to get your thoughts on as someone that was in product marketing.
Yeah.
In trying to gather intel on a competitor's product offering, do you have any best practices on how to secret shop them? So I think this is the idea around, you know, I'm sure we've seen the tactic of like pretending to be a prospect to a competitor, kind of going through their sales process, getting that intel. What are some of your best practices in learning a little bit more about the sales processes of like a competitor or what they're using to deposition us, for example?
Yeah, that's a super good question. And that's part of the hardest part of competitive intelligence, which is actually getting the intelligence. And I think in regards to secret shopping as a tactic, that's where you want to have alignment with your executive leadership team over the importance of competitive intelligence, but the tactics that you want to use to obtain it. For example, I've been part of businesses where philosophically they don't believe in team shopping, and I think secret shopping, and there's even legal liabilities behind that. So as a product marketer, it's like, okay, cool, can't do that, don't even have to worry about it. And then up in other situations where the executive team is like, don't love the idea of it, but we're open to it if you can do it. So that's where it can get a little hairy. Obviously, if you're in a situation where there's product-led growth and you can try the products, that's an easy way to do it. Looking up things on YouTube, looking up user reviews, all those same avenues that everyone probably knows about can be helpful if you don't have the ability to do secret shopping. There's also official companies that you can hire to help with that. Again, it comes back to how important it is with the executive to get the budget for that. So there's a few different ways depending on kind of what buy-in you can get from your executive team.
Yeah, no,
I know that's a little bit of a vague answer, but
yeah, no, and you're obviously trying to protect yourself there, but no, I get, and you know, it's true. I think there's this. Sometimes it feels like the only way to kind of get that intel is to kind of do some of those like secret shopping methods or anything like that. But I think one of the things that I've definitely learned from a lot of my customers is there's so much information out there, right? And I think why we kind of immediately get to a point where we're like, oh, we have to do the secret shopping method is because some of it is just like laziness. It's like, hey, I don't want to have to go through all this intel and kind of like map out like clearly this is what how they're trying to approach things. This is how they're reaching out to customers. I think there's a lot of things you can, like to your point, user reviews, things like that, where you can kind of hear from customers as well, or prospects that have worked with them before, the approaches that they're trying to use. And it doesn't necessarily have to kind of get to a point where you have to do the secret shopping method. I know we're at the top of the hour here, but no, this was a great discussion, Jer. Always love, talking shop with you.
Happy
definitely want to give you a bit of a shout out.
Klue podcast over here.
Give you a bit of a shout out. So again, you can reach out to either of us on LinkedIn. Obviously Jer is way smarter than I am with all this stuff.
True.
Feel free to reach out if you're looking for tactics or anything that he's done in his experience. But it's one thing that I definitely want to kind of drill home to people is, we've been in the trenches together. And I think one of the things that we've often seen is just that alignment piece. I know you hated that buzzword, but that's sort of the point home that we want to take to everyone, is that getting that alignment across the organization is super important, especially with competitive intelligence. And we've seen value out of that across a number of different areas, and happy to talk about that more. So feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. And Jer, always a pleasure. I know I will continue to pick your brain moving forward as well. And I'm
Likewise.
Excited for your role at Slack. And I'm excited to hear some of the feedback that you start to learn about back into the sales world, moving from product marketing.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks to all the attendees as well. If anyone is still on and ever wants to talk about product marketing or sales or solutions engineering, I love all this stuff. So feel free to look me up, and happy to chat anytime too.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thanks everyone. And thanks, Mackenzie, for helping host. And again, there will be a lot of follow-up content and a recording as well of the webinar. So if anyone did miss out on any of it, we're happy to share that out after. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.